Hello, I'm Donna Leight. I'm the president of the French and Indian War Foundation in Winchester, Virginia. And today, myself and Carl Ekberg are here to talk about something that happened at Fort Loudoun. We're actually on the Fort Loudoun site in Winchester. It's an interesting story that happened in 1757, probably something that most people have never heard about, basically because there's very little information out there about it. So we're going to dig into this story and share it with you.
Try though you may, the story we're going to tell cannot be found in any book. You can't go to any library and dig this story up in the library because it's really never been told before. So for starters, Winchester has two hyper interesting periods: the Civil War, the 1860s, and the French and Indian War, the 1750s. And I would say that the two most famous days in all of Winchester's history would be the last day of the Third Battle of Winchester and the day that we're going to talk about now, the June 20th, 1757. The two most important days, most interesting days in Winchester's history. So what we're going to talk about was set within something called the 7 Years' War in Europe, commonly known as the French and Indian War in America. And this was in fact a world war fought on three continents, Asia, Europe, and North America, as well as being fought on the high seas. We of course are interested in North America, and it really began as competition over control of the strategic forks of the Ohio. And I would make reference here to a great French map which shows the forks of the Ohio, which is now where Pittsburgh is located, where the French Fort Duquesne was located. And so the competition was who would control the Ohio Valley and the land immediately west of the Allegheny Mountains. And the French position on this was that the line of demarcation should be the top of the Allegheny Mountains, and that when the British, including George Washington, crossed over that continental divide into the greater Ohio River Valley, that they were trespassing on French territory. So Winchester was in fact, once again referring to the French map, which they call Winchester, because there's no such thing as a W in the French language, Winchester or Fredericktown, according to the French cartographer. Winchester was at the center of this at the beginning of the war, in fact, for many years, because Winchester was the jumping off point to get to the forks of the Ohio. If you were going to go to the forks of the Ohio, you went through Winchester. And that is why Washington eventually sets up here and why Fort Loudoun then was created as a bastion to try to defend the frontier, the western frontier. So starting out in 1754 was a very bad year. It was the year of the disaster at Fort Necessity, when Washington had to ignominiously surrender to Louis Coulon de Villiers at Fort Necessity, a really, really humiliating event in his life, something that he never forgot. So 54 was a bad year. Then we go on to 55, which was a worse year for the Brits, because it's the year of the famous defeat of Braddock. Washington was there, usually called the Battle of the Monongahela, only a few miles outside of Pittsburgh, when Braddock's army, including George Washington, was really decimated by French and Indian forces as they were approaching Fort Duquesne. Braddock's intention, along with Washington, was to throw the French out of Fort Duquesne and take control of the forks of the Ohio, because Fort Duquesne dominated the forks of the Ohio, and they were completely thwarted in that event. And so 1755 was even worse than 1754 for the Brits. Then we can move on to 1756, which was not a good year either. In 56, the French actually got as far as the Cacapon River. That's as close as they ever really got to Winchester. They never really, the French and the Indians as hostile forces, never did penetrate into Winchester itself, but they got close. They got to the Picote River and killed a number of people there in 1756. The same year, 1756, in southern Virginia, at Fort Vaux, a Frenchman named Francois-Marie Picoté de Belestre, and that's a name that we have to keep in mind, Belestre, led a group of French and Indians and completely destroyed Fort Vaux in southern Virginia, killed a bunch of people, and took a number of captives. And so going back, 54, bad year. 55, a worse year. 56, not a good year either. So that sets the scene for our period of 1757. So we need to understand that the events we're going to talk about in some detail in 1757 was an era when the Brits were really on their back foot. They had been pushed and pushed and pushed by the French coming out of Fort Duquesne along with their Indian allies. And so in reaction to the aggressiveness of the French and the Indians, Washington was charged with creating a defensive bastion in Winchester, the westernmost defensive bastion in Virginia, called Fort Loudoun. And so here we have a depiction done in Washington's hand of Fort Loudoun as he designed it up on the hill. And you can see that it was, in fact, a very major fortification. And looking at this map from Warren Hofstra's book on the settlements of early Virginia, you can see that Fort Loudoun, actually this plat map shows Fort Loudoun dominating the city of Winchester. Winchester as a population, we don't know for sure, of only several hundred people. And then there were several hundred people as well at the fort in the form of George Washington's Virginia Regiment, which we might call the Virginia Militia. And what I would like to emphasize here is the importance of this whole enterprise, the Fort Loudoun enterprise, as an engine of development for Winchester. In 1750, Winchester, usually called Fredericktown at that time, was an insignificant crossroads. By 1760, Winchester was a boom town. And so let me briefly quote Warren Hofstra on that subject. The construction of the fort of this size and complexity contributed significantly to economic growth in the town of Winchester. And I would say that Warren would acknowledge, and Warren's a friend of ours and a member of the French and Indian War Foundation, I think Warren would acknowledge that that really is an understatement, that the French and Indian War and the building of Fort Loudoun was really the making of Winchester, and there was a huge surge of economic development because of the French and Indian War and the building of Fort Loudoun.
Carl's done a good job at setting the stage of what was going on previous to the story we're going to talk about. Our story takes place in 1757, but in 55, like he said, we had a lot of other things happen. Actually, in 54, Jumonville Glen, I don't know if you mentioned that, but that was quite a controversial mess, and that's another whole story, but that kind of started things even before Fort Necessity. We talked about Braddock and the local people of the area in Winchester and the Virginia frontier had really high hopes that Braddock was going to be successful in taking Fort Duquesne because there had been a lot of incursions on the western frontier at that time, but that was not to be. So that actually, that caused a general panic, ensued on the frontier at that point, and bigger than the Virginia frontier, of course. That was the same period in 55 when the British forced the Acadians out of present-day Nova Scotia in a mass exodus, afraid that they were going to side with the French. If I look at the Fort Loudoun area in Winchester and the western frontier, a lot of things happened then. A lot of people had already moved east of the Blue Ridge Mountains where it was relatively safe. Different colonies were building the string of forts. Fort Frederick up in Maryland was built in 55. It's quite a fortification. And then in 55, the Virginia House of Burgesses also approved the building of all the forts, including Fort Loudoun in Winchester. That construction of Fort Loudoun and Winchester started in 1756. And I do want to point out there are multiple Fort Loudons. So there's the one in Winchester, there's one in Pennsylvania, and there's one in Tennessee. And in a lot of books you'll read, like we were looking at Croghan's book the other day, me and you, and they mentioned Fort Loudoun many times, but Pennsylvania was George Croghan's territory, and he was always talking about it in Pennsylvania.
So, Donna, let me ask you. I'm an historian by profession, and it's understandable that I would know something about this because I've always been an 18th century historian. But I'm just curious. I don't know you all that well. What kind of sources were you able to use? You seem to be really knowledgeable about this. So how did you become so knowledgeable?
Well, on this story, this is a period of history that I've studied too, but most of it's just through 20 years of reading different books and trying to figure out what was going on. I've always been interested in the Ohio country and the fight for it with the Shawnee. That's more of what I know. But Founders Online actually has great documentation. It's part of the archives, the National Archives, so it's got a wealth of information.
That's really what I was driving at. To come back to my first point, you ain't going to find this stuff in any book. And
No.
so, I mean, you just mentioned it. The Founders Online is a fabulous source which gives us the source materials.
Primary sources.
The primary sources.
Yeah, it
That's
was the
right.
letters.
Primary sources.
Yep.
Primary sources.
Yep.
I remember my mentor at Rutgers University, where I did my PhD, saying what history is confronting the sources and making sense of them. But it's the primary sources. So I want everyone to know that Donna has been using primary sources because I'm repeating myself, but you ain't going to find this material in any book.
Fortunately,
So-
Steve Reason,
Right.
member, had done research on this, and he left us his treasure trove of documents. He had printed out all this correspondence between Dinwiddie and Washington and the various people that we're going to talk about these events that we're talking about. So, and they came out of the Founders Online. Back to where we were. I want to talk a few minutes about the settlers here and the reactions that were going on. I said, but many of them had gone east of the Blue Ridge Mountains where they were relatively safe. A lot of them went to the forts that were being built, the string of forts that were defended. But many of them also went to home forts. People would fortify their homes. That wasn't not always successfully, but that was a place they went. And then many of them stayed where they were on their farms, and a lot of them didn't survive these incursions that did occur, and they're documented throughout many books. People were captive, killed or captured. But we have to also remember that a lot of people that were out in the mountain range, Virginia frontier, there was still the controversy of whose land it was. Was it British? Was it French? And so that's where a lot of people got wiped out when the French and their native allies came in. The boundary there, you just talked about the boundary being at the top of the mountain. That's what we thought, right? That's what the British thought.
Right. The French were insisting that the boundary between French territory and English territory was the top of the Allegheny Mountains.
Okay.
And that meant that the entire greater Ohio River Valley was, quote, French territory. So when Louis Coulon de Villiers humiliated George Washington at Fort Necessity in 1754, in July of 1754, he obligated Washington to acknowledge that the proper boundary between French territory and British territory was in fact the top of the Allegheny Mountains. And so that Fort Necessity, which was in the watershed of the Ohio, not the watershed of the Potomac, the location of Fort Necessity was actually on French territory in the view of the French and the commanding officer, Coulon de Villiers. So the French said, no coming over the top of the mountains. You do that, you're on the territory of King Louis XV.
Yeah. And this was in 1755 is when the French and Indian War officially began, ending in 63. And even with the Treaty of Paris at the end of the war, the proclamation line was at the Eastern Continental Divide, which is still at the top of the Allegheny Mountains there.
In
So
in
that was not
63,
given up.
the British The British assumed control over the territory all the way west to the Mississippi, but the proclamation line was an attempt to prevent settlements from crossing.
Yeah.
Right. So the British used the proclamation line as the same boundary that the French used earlier when they were trying to separate French from British territory. Right.
But that didn't stop settlers, of course, from going over there.
That did not
Right.
stop. That's right.
And they were upset when they weren't protected, but they were past the British line.
Right. Hence, we move on to the American Revolution.
Yeah,
Right.
there you go.
Right.
So another thing that was going on in Winchester in 1756, there was a Virginia newspaper printed some really bad information about the Virginia militia. It really disrespected them, the people and their efforts. There was a mass resignation that was threatened, which didn't help things. Luckily, even Washington was threatening to resign, but that mass resignation never happened. But still, all of the Virginia forts were undermanned. Washington did not have enough people to protect the frontier, the 250 miles of Virginia frontier. And so Dinwiddie asked him to abandon some of the forts and only keep 7 of the forts defended. So that didn't help the cause either, because now the French and their Indian allies could get closer, and did. And so, that just made things worse. Another thing Dinwiddie had been trying to do, he was the governor of Virginia, he was trying to convince some of the southern Native American tribes to support the British by helping with patrols and scouting, which was, some of their expertise. In exchange, they would give them gifts, which was the typical way to get their favor and their support. And in 1757, he was finally successful because Native Americans came to Winchester. So there was several of them from down in the Carolinas. There was the Catawbas and the Cherokee. And in March, they started coming north. Some of the Catawbas went off to Williamsburg, and others came into Winchester. About 100 came into Winchester at that point. And about 100 Cherokee came up. I think in the end it was about 150, came north with Chief Wabahatchee and Chief Swallow. And by April of 1757, there was about 200 Native Americans in Winchester. So you had Catawbas, about 125 by that point, 150 Cherokee. The Cherokee, like I said, were under Wabahatchee and Swallow. There were a few Tuscarora and a few Nottaways.
Do we have any idea where these Indians were encamped?
They weren't around Fort Loudoun. I know in 53 there was a conference and they were down by where the old courthouse is, but I don't know where they were. But I would imagine they were down by the Town Run area. I don't know. What I do know is that the locals were terrified. So you had, 200 Native Americans here. They didn't look like them. They didn't talk like them. They didn't act like them. They were, it was very unsettling. They weren't happy because they didn't get the gifts that they'd been promised. So by May, most of them had left, and they weren't staying to support and do the scouting. So Chief Swallow stayed, him and some of his men, but he was pretty upset he hadn't gotten his gifts. Let me mention one more thing I did forget about, and I thought worth mentioning. So they were here. They weren't well received in town. And Washington, I got a few quotes from Washington that I think are worth hearing. Washington said of the Catawbas, "They have been of little use, but a great expense to the colony." So we had to give them gifts, and in the end, they didn't really support us in that time. But something about George Washington that we know from reading a lot of his letters on Founders Online and other places, while he was an exceptional man, we all know who George Washington is, our president and founding father, he was biased and prejudiced against Native Americans. He refers to them a lot in not so nice ways. In a letter on May 24th, 1757, on a letter to Dinwiddie, he wrote of Wabahatchee and his Cherokee as the most insolent, most avaricious, which means greedy, and most dissatisfied wretches I have ever had to deal with. So it must have been quite a time in Winchester when this was going on. But we have to remember, too, on George Washington, he was only 25 at the time. He was way young. He wasn't the general. He wasn't the statesman. He wasn't the founding father that we knew today. He was a young man. So that kind of brings us up to 1757. And So these few Cherokee that stay that are with Chief Swallow, 15 of them, they agree to go with Lieutenant John Baker and go on a patrol out past Fort Duquesne to Logstown. So they leave Fort Loudoun, they head out west. I'm not sure how far they got, but at some point before they got to Fort Duquesne, they had an engagement with the French. And they come back to Fort Cumberland and report what had happened. Basically, they killed all the Frenchmen and their natives, whoever it was that attacked them, except for one man. They had one prisoner of war, a French ensign, that we're going to talk about, the subject of our story. And unfortunately, at the same time, the Cherokee's Chief Swallow had been killed in that encounter. So that was about, I think it was June 8th when they got back to Fort Cumberland. And just a few days later, word came, reported to the, so that was a Maryland fort. The commander of that fort got a report that the French were coming from Fort Duquesne with wagons and artillery. And it was a big group, and they were coming for Fort Cumberland. So of course, that's not that big a distance. It caused a lot of unease, and they sent a message here to Fort Loudoun, which got here the next day. The next evening, reinforcements were called in. It was a really tense time. And then a couple days later, the commander, whose name was Dagworthy, I think, found out that the information had been in error and no one was coming. They were not under attack, but everyone was on high alert. That was about that time was when Lieutenant Baker decided, okay, we're heading to Winchester. We don't need to stay here. And on June 19th, Lieutenant Baker, his men, and Swallow's people, and Belestre, the man of our story, came to Winchester on June 19th. And
Donna, do you know, was Lieutenant Baker, was he part of Washington's command?
I think he was.
So when he went out in pursuit of the French, he went out from Fort Loudoun.
Well, he went from Fort Cumberland. So yeah, I don't know. We need to find. I'm trying to make a list of all.
Right, I think so. I think that his mission must have originated at Fort Loudoun.
Okay, I've been trying to make a list of all these different guys because it's quite confusing to me.
Okay, so let's deal then with the dramatis personae, the people who were central to this interrogation of the Frenchman. Let's start with Belestre himself. He came from a warrior family. His father was Francois-Marie Picoté de Belestre, and I would like to point out that it's remarkable to me that these minor French aristocrats from France could come to North America and be so successful as frontier warriors. And so the Picoté de Belestre family is one example. Even more famous is the Coulon de Villiers family, which of course one member of humiliated Washington at Fort Necessity in 1754. And as we'll see, these families, these French, they're families of minor French aristocrats who come to North America to make their fortunes, wind up as frontier warriors, and are just exceedingly good at it. And there was a certain class of them, and they as we shall see, they did tend to intermarry. And so this was a young man. I haven't been able to find his birth certificate, but I think he was born about 1740.
Okay.
And so we can tell that he's still probably a teenager at this time. But he is an officer. He's an ensign, the lowest rank of officer. And it's interesting to speculate about his language skills. He may have known something about Indian languages, but I don't think he knew any English. I don't think that when he was interrogated that they could do that in English. Okay, so a second person then at the interrogation was George Washington himself, a relatively young man, not as young as Belestre, but a young man. Washington had some issues that were grinding on him. One is, of course, that no one could forget how he had messed up and been humiliated at Fort Necessity in 1754. No one was going to forget that. Secondly, he was at odds with another member that was at the interrogation, the George Croghan, whom Washington blamed for not having provided him with necessary supplies when he was at Fort Necessity. So among the interrogators, there was competition, probably even some animosity. In any case, Robert Dinwiddie, the governor of Virginia, wrote to George Washington, Mr. George Croghan, a gentleman well acquainted with Indian affairs, is being engaged by me to serve as my interpreter. I therefore desire that you show him a proper regard, and in such matters as relating to the delivery of presents, etc., you will consult with him. I'm your most humble servant, Dinwiddie. And so this guy is known up and down the frontier as an expert in Indian affairs, that he and Washington are not friendly. They're in a certain sense in competition to see who's going to kind of be in charge of things on the frontier.
I kind of see that with Croghan and Atkin too. And some of the things that I've read, because Croghan was from the north.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, Croghan was a representative of William Johnson, the head of Indian Affairs in the North. So for them to be recognized, Croghan, as a specialist in affairs in Virginia, I think that's true.
Because Atkins thought he shouldn't be able to treat and give gifts in Pennsylvania. Fort Loudoun, Pennsylvania, they were giving gifts, and Atkins says, "Well, you can't. I'm giving them at Fort Loudoun. We can't give the same guys gifts." And Croghan disagreed.
So Atkin was appointed. Here is Governor Dinwiddie to George Washington. Sir, this probably may be delivered to you by the Honorable Edmund Atkin, Esquire, who has His Majesty's commission to transact and superintend all affairs with the different tribes of Indians, Georgia, South and North Carolina, and this Dominion of Virginia. I desire that you will receive him in a genteel manner, etc., etc., etc. So Governor Dinwiddie seemed to want to make sure that Washington was going to be hospitable to his representative, Atkin. So Atkin is a member of the interrogating committee on the important day, July 20th, 1757. Washington himself, interestingly enough, I couldn't find correspondence between George Croghan and George Washington, but they knew one another very, very well. And Washington, though he didn't like Croghan and was in competition with him to be in charge, Washington did acknowledge in a letter of 20th June 1757, our important day, he says, Mr. Croghan will write to you by this express and will no doubt be more explicit on Indian affairs than I can pretend to be. So Washington is acknowledging, it's kind of a high compliment because the whole issue was Indian affairs. And so you have to give some credit to Washington that though he blamed Croghan for his defeat at Fort Necessity and was in competition with him, that Washington nonetheless was honest enough to acknowledge that Croghan was an expert at Indian affairs. And so we have then, as the interrogating committee, first of all, the interrogated person was Francois-Louis Picoté de Belestre, and the people interrogating him were George Washington, Edmund Atkin, the representative of the governor of Virginia, and George Croghan, who, though was a representative of William Johnson of New York, was nonetheless assigned as interpreter and expert in Indian affairs to deal with things in Virginia as well as in Pennsylvania and New York. And so this is a pretty illustrious group that we have in Winchester in June 1757, and particularly the fateful day of June 20th, 1757. In addition to that, we have reference to another interpreter. George Croghan was the interpreter of the Indian languages, and there may have been several Indian languages spoken, because Cherokee is an Algonquian. No, Cherokee is an Iroquoian language, whereas most of the other languages in the area were actually Algonquian. like the Shawnees spoke an Algonquian language, and
Catawbas,
the
I don't know.
Cherokee spoke an Iroquois language.
And I don't know the Catawbas, what they spoke. I don't know.
Something else again too.
Okay.
But it wasn't. I mean, these are mutually unintelligible Indian languages. So it's Croghan had his work cut out for him as interrogator. So Atkin arrived in Winchester on June 3rd, fully 2 weeks before Belestre was brought into town as a prisoner. But we don't know what the relationship was between Atkin and George Washington. Atkin was housed somewhere in Winchester, we don't know where. And when he communicated with Washington, instead of walking up half a mile or less to Fort Loudoun, he wrote long letters to Washington. It's very strange that these guys were almost within hailing distance of one another, and yet they communicated by writing. And Washington didn't seem to want to condescend to come into town to talk to Atkins. So
he was busy writing letters.
Right. There's a lot of competition within this with this group of interrogators. And then there's another party named Richard Smith, who was designated also as interpreter, and his business was interpreting. He's really central to this because he's not an interpreter of English languages, but he knows French. And so he was very central to this interrogation that took place. The French ensign, the young, still a teenager, Belestre, was brought into town on the 19th, and immediately a couple of Washington's junior officers got a hold of him and took him down into town to a tavern to drink. and on this wonderful map of Born-Hofstra's, actually, it shows precisely the tavern of Henry Heath, where these officers of Washington immediately took the French guy down to have a drinking party in a tavern in Winchester. And when Atkin, who's not very far away in his dwellings on what is now Loudoun Street, he went nuts about it. He said, what the hell is going on? What are these guys doing, taking this Frenchman out for a drinking party when he's supposed to be, this is supposed to be high-level intelligence that he's going to provide for us.
And he wrote letters about it. He was upset.
Yeah, he wrote.
We have the correspondence that he sent. Well, who do they think they are?
Yeah, once again, he's almost in hailing distance of Washington. He writes a 3-page letter to Washington screaming about the drinking party that's taking place in Heath's Tavern. And he says to Washington, "It is easy to foresee the tendency of this ill-judged and silly spirit and behavior of your officers. It cannot but affect me in my office, and consequently in His Majesty's service, for which reason I think it fit to lay before you, not in the least doubting from your natural good sense and prudence, that you will put a check on it and cut it in the bud." He's outraged. And so the sum and substance of this is, once the guys had been drinking in the tavern and came out, Atkin did manage to corral the French officer and sequester him somewhere. We're not sure where, whether in his quarters or up at the fort itself.
And then at some point he tells Washington he's ready to interrogate, and Washington's too busy.
Right.
He's writing letters.
That's right. Atkin said, I need to discuss this with you, and Washington said, sorry, too busy writing letters.
Some to you.
Right. And so the interrogation, June 20th, 1757, certainly the most interesting thing ever to transpire at Fort Loudoun, because there were never any shots fired there. And so what was going on there? And it was an important thing, Fort Loudoun, important for Winchester, hugely important. But no shots ever fired in anger at Fort Loudoun. So this interrogation is a really, really interesting document. It doesn't really tell us a whole lot. Okay, so keep it in mind, for the Brits, 1754 had been a bad year. 1755 had been a worse year. Yeah. 1756, the French and the Indians get within about 20 miles of Winchester. And so in 1757, The Brits, including George Washington and George Croghan, who's loyal to the Brits, and Edmund Atkin, all these guys are really interested in what the hell the French are doing in the Ohio River Valley. And so it strikes me in reading this interrogation, which is a fairly lengthy affair, that the French ensign Belestre really does pretty much tell the truth about what's going on there. So he says that when he left Fort Duquesne, that would have been his base of operations, when he left Fort Duquesne, there was a garrison of 300 men, one half of which were regulars and the other half militia. Keep it in mind that in Washington's Fort Loudoun, there were no British regulars. And also keep it in mind that one of the things that really rubbed Washington the wrong way is that the British Army was never willing to give him a commission in the British Army. Washington was, at this time, was never anything more than an officer in the Virginia militia, called the Virginia Regiment. But at Fort Duquesne, there were French regulars, which would have been French Marines, and the other half were militia that had come down from the St. Lawrence River Valley. That they daily expected a reinforcement of 300 more from Montreal, which are to be stationed there until next spring. That a great body of Indians to the number of 1,500, composed of Illinois, Upper Cherokees, and Creeks, was also expected, which he supposed was arrived by this time, who were to be employed in scouting parties to annoy the frontiers of the 3 neighboring colonies. And so we understand at this point that the French are serious about beefing up Fort Duquesne, that they were serious about it, that they had regular French Marines there as well as militiamen from Canada, and that they had this huge contingent of Indians at Fort Duquesne. There was never at Fort Loudoun an established community of Indians in support of the Brits. And so once again we come back, it's kind of a truism, but it's a true truism that indeed the French were dealing with the Indians more successfully than the Brits were. So that's about it. And of course, as Donna's going to explain to us, when they're done with this interrogation, that the Brits are expecting that they're going to have a prisoner, the ensign, Picoté de Belestre, but the Cherokees have a totally different idea about this. And one sees,
Yep.
Even glancing at these materials that Donna and I have been going through, one sees very quickly that you never know what the Indians are going to do.
Yep.
The Native Americans,
Yeah,
you cannot guess in advance what they're going to do. How the Cherokees from the Carolinas were up at Fort Cumberland to begin with, I'd love to know that, but they had their own minds. Yep. For sure.
Well, yeah. So after the interrogation, we don't know if Washington tried to keep him as a prisoner or not, but the Cherokee were having none of it. He was their property. They called him Swallow's people. So Chief Swallow had been killed, and he was their prisoner. So they weren't going to return him to the British. So you have to think about it too. There's just so many things we don't know. Belestre may have been talking to the Cherokee and said, "Hey, we can give you better gifts. The French typically treat you better than the British do. Take me with you. I'm on your side, really." It could have been that they knew his father. His father was a captain, and he was quite well known on the French side, and maybe there was some influence there for the Cherokee. And then there was one place, forget a piece of correspondence where Washington calls Belestre a braggart, Gasconian. Is that the right term in French?
Yeah.
That's the way it translated to me, was he was a braggart. So for all,
He's come on Gascon, right, okay. Right, a braggart. Right.
Yeah. So it could be that, Belestre was just very good at convincing these Cherokee, take me with you,
Right. Picking up on your point, this ensign, Picoté de Belestre, his father had been active in southern Virginia on the frontier fighting the Brits back in 1756. And so the name You know, when
probably
when the
known.
Cherokees take him down there, his father had been there the year before.
Yeah.
So, you know, it might explain part of his success down
Yep.
there. Right.
Yep. So they took him south with them, and they actually considered him their new chief. I don't know if he was replacing Chief Swallow, but
Here's an 18-year-old,
yeah,
maybe 17.
hot stuff. Yeah.
Right.
So in September 58, Colonel Henry Bouquet on the British side heard that Belestre was still with the Cherokee, and that the governor of Virginia and Carolina made them offers of considerable sums and presents for his ransom, but the Cherokee refused absolutely to release him. So there's also correspondence where, you know, his father said that he stayed with him for the next 5 years with the Cherokee, fighting for the French side against the British. And we believe he was part of the Anglo-Cherokee War on 58 to 61. Another person that we've kind of lost track of that I mentioned was Chief Wauwahatchie. While Swallow was killed, Wauwahatchie went back south to the Cherokee with the Cherokee. He went back with Belestre at that time, and he went on to be pro-French. He fought with the French as well at that time. So Carl's going to tell us what happened to this Frenchman after that.
I want to come back for a second to Edmund Atkin, or Atkins. I'm not sure whether
I think it's Atkin.
Is it Atkin?
I think so.
I don't know whether there's an S on it or not. In any case, so he is obviously an emissary from Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia. And as he himself says, he arrived in Winchester on June 3rd. And so he did not come to Winchester to interrogate Belestre.
Yeah, because Belestre didn't even get back to until the 8th to June. Yeah, and he got to Fort Cumberland on the 8th.
It just so happened that Atkin
was here
when Belestre was brought in. But I don't think Croghan got into town until the 19th himself. I think he came down for the interrogation.
I think he did too. I think I read that somewhere.
Right, which raises another question. At the interrogation, were there any Cherokees present?
You can bet there weren't. Well, don't know. Swallow had been killed.
Right.
His 14 men, of those, I don't know if Wauwahatchie was still here.
We don't even know.
Yeah, he would have been here, but I don't know if he would have been.
We don't even know with absolute certainty where the interrogation took place. I'm thinking almost certainly it's Fort Loudoun.
Yeah. Could
conceivably have been Atkins' domicile, but we don't even know where he was domiciled. So I think we're safe to say that, but it is just fortuitous that Atkin happened to be here.
Yeah.
When Belestre was brought in from Cumberland. So after his astonishing success, I'm still thinking, I mean, he's a teenager. And he goes down and he manages to flip the Cherokees and make them allies of the French. And he spent a number of years down there. Then, this is an interesting a little bit of population change, that after the French lost at Niagara and at Quebec, both in 1759, after those two big battles, the French and Indian War was in many ways kind of over, even though Belestre continued his activities in southern Virginia and North Carolina. And as the French were seeing the coming of the end of the war, they were moving west.
Yeah.
And so, as the war was winding down after the major British victories at Montreal and Quebec and Niagara, many of these French guys including French officers, were moving west. And so our ensign, Picoté de Belestre, did move out to the Illinois country, and I have reference here to a map showing the French settlements in the Illinois country. And there was a major French fortification out there, Fort de Chartres, and there's a wonderful state historic site there now in Illinois, on the Illinois side of the river, about 50 miles south of St. Louis. If you're in the St. Louis area, it's worth visiting Fort de Chartres. It was really it was a much more sizable, and it was a stone fortress, much more impressive than Fort Loudoun in Winchester, and there's a great historic site at Fort de Chartres now. Okay, so we know that he wound up there because we have, curiously enough, his marriage certificate, his marriage record signed by him. Here's the signature, Picoté Belestre. And he married into another great warrior family. He married Jumonville's niece, the daughter of Francois Coulon de Villiers. And so this marriage record not only reveals that Picoté had removed himself from the East Coast to Fort de Chartres in the Illinois country, but it also reveals that this is a merger of two great French minor aristocratic warrior families with the intermarriage of Jumonville's niece and Picoté de Belestre. This is April 3rd, 1762. It's a wonderful marriage record. After this marriage at Fort de Chartres, they moved across the river to the brand new town of St. Louis, and were some of the very original, Picoté de Belestre and his wife are some of the original inhabitants of St. Louis, although that is little recognized in St. Louis today. He was an important citizen of early St. Louis. Years later, he moves with his father-in-law, Francois Coulon de Villiers, down to New Orleans. But for years, he lived actually in St. Louis. So that is the end of that story, huh? And so, what can we say to wind up?
I just think it's just an interesting little piece, of Virginia's rich frontier history that no one knows about, hardly anybody. And one thing worth mentioning, I think, this was a period when there were so many things going on, and it led up to what I consider America's first Civil War, the Revolutionary War. A lot of the men that were involved in this on the British side, they fought on the French and Indian War and in this era with Colonel George Washington, and they would go on to fight. A lot of these got their training there and went on to fight with General George Washington in the Rev War.
The interrogation of Belestre in 1757 is his second encounter with a Frenchman, and then he doesn't see any Frenchmen again. He doesn't see any Frenchmen again until 17. When did the first French? He doesn't. I think the next Frenchman he meets would have been during the American Revolution.
What, Lafayette?
20 years. Lafayette may have been the third Frenchman he met.
And he thought very highly of that man.
Of course. And then there's a love affair between Washington and Frenchmen. The love affair didn't start in the 1750s. It started in the 1770s.
Well, he actually had his first one was with Jumonville Glen. That was probably his first encounter, but that story wasn't really told at that time.
His encounter there was having the Frenchman's brains spattered on him. Yep. Right. Never got a chance to talk to him.
Nope.
Jumonville wanted to talk to him. He never got a chance.
I mean, there's still...
One could actually write a book on George Washington's relationship with Frenchmen.
There you go, Carl.
Jumonville, Louis Coulon de Villiers, Francois-Louis Picoté de Belestre, finally Lafayette and Rochambeau. One could do that.
There you
One
go.
could do a book. Washington never learned to speak any French.
None?
Surely, none whatsoever.
Well, Hamilton did, so Hamilton probably helped.
Did.
Yes.
Yeah, Hamilton did.
With
for
others.
Sure. And Hamilton was by his side, so Hamilton would have been his interpreter for sure.
I'm sure.
Yep. I would like to come back to using a map. This is the pretty well-known Frye-Jefferson map.
Oh, I love that map. It's my favorite.
From the mid-1750s. But one of the things that it reveals, and you can see it, is how Winchester was a nexus for transportation.
Yes.
You have the Great Wagon Road coming down from Philadelphia. You have the several roads heading down to Alexandria.
Yep.
Including one through Ashby Gap.
Yep.
Maybe a connection there. And so, as it is today, Winchester was a transportation hub.
It was.
And
then it went west to Fort Duquesne and Cumberland, and it went south. I think that was still the Indian trip. What did they call it? The Indian Road on, I think, the Jefferson map.
I don't know. You might be able to find it on there. In any case, I want to come back to the fact that the French and Indian War was the making of Winchester. Winchester of 1760, not recognizable to anyone who knew the place in 1750. It was the surge of investment in the area. And so the locals were providing wheat and barley. They were providing lumber. They were providing a lot of leather goods. They were providing both beef and pork. This building of Fort Loudoun was a huge investment, a huge surge of investment in Winchester. Was really the creation of the town. Right. Well, thanks, Donna.
Thank you, Carl.
We could do this another time and talk about the same subject and talk about a whole different variety of issues, actually. But this has been good.
Yep.
Thank you.
So I thank everybody for watching.